All right, party people, we are finishing up the 4-part series called Teen and Christian. And in the first episode, we kind of talked about getting inspired with some Christian heroes. The second episode, we talked a little bit more about kind of the needs that we have when we're lazy and how to get motivated. Fighting sloth and learning to discipline ourselves to some extent, even as young people, on how to be motivated. But being motivated is that you have to work at it, okay? And then last time we talked about, in episode 3, we talked about faith and doubt and how this kind of instance, when it takes away all the things that are scheduled in your life, it shows kind of for every one of us, adults included, what we typically put our faith in, what we typically are putting our hope in. And when those things are pulled away from us, it makes us angry. It can make us sad. It can make us despondent or disillusioned. And then a lot of times our faith has been maybe more tethered to religious activities or just being social. Being an extrovert or being really, deep in thought, then necessarily is it really tethered to God. It's just tethered to those things. And so it leads us to doubt. And so we kind of struggle with the mixture of faith and doubt. And so we talked about that last time. So for our final discussion, I'm going to talk about really the social aspect of the challenge of this pandemic, and basically a word on being a Christian, okay? A word on being Christian is basically this. Christianity is a highly social religion, okay? The Buddhist could go to a mountain, can go to the temple, can really frankly go anywhere, but they like to be elevated, okay? Because they believe in enlightenment, okay? So you empty your mind and you kind of ascend and level up into some form of enlightenment, which is some sort of knowledge that you gain from the divine. You could do this without anybody around. But because Buddhists are humans, they like to congregate with other people. But they don't have to. Buddhists don't need other people to be enlightened. They just need a connection to the divine. Christianity is the complete opposite of that, okay? We focus on the mind being renewed, but we need people because God has shown himself, revealed himself, unveiled himself in flesh. That community is actually necessary in God because we believe God is triune. 3 persons, 1 essence. Father, Son, and Spirit. 1 God, but there is a communion that God has even in himself, if we can say it like that. So the Christian family, the Christian community, the people of God are not some unnecessary extra thing. It actually shows what God's like. So therefore, being social is really Christian. It's really Christian. So what are we supposed to do when we've got all that social stuff basically outlawed, which is it should be right now? But what should we do when our presence is not allowed to be near one another? What do we do? I think for a lot of us, it brings out a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear of isolation that comes out. I've talked to a lot of you in the last couple of weeks, and there's a lot of, I haven't got to talk to my friends, haven't seen my friends, haven't had my social time, haven't been able to go to church. I've been watching church, it's just not the same without being there. I can absolutely agree with you. I struggled in the same ways. So there's kind of a fear of isolation, and it leads to loneliness, right? And then there's this other thing, for some of you, right, where it's the fear that you had of going to church, of community with people, has been relieved. Now you get to sit in your underwear and your jams all day long and not engage with anybody or have to because it's the law. And so that fear, that kind of antisocial thing that fits better for you, it's kind of been helped in some sense by this. So your fear of community has been kind of relieved. You've been released a little bit from that, right? To kind of go hide a little bit, right? But what does God really want for us? Does he want us to be lonely? And does he want us to be kind of self-assured and being isolated? I don't really think he wants either of those things. I don't think he wants us to be overly indulgent in community. I also don't think he wants us to be indulgent in isolation. So I'm going to read just a couple excerpts from the book Life Together by one of the greatest Christians this past century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He writes a poignant encouragement about both of these errors, these trials in being social, but yet it's not always there. It's not always a privilege. And this is what he says, and this is in Life Together, and it's from his 3rd chapter called The Day Alone. And this is what he says: whoever cannot be alone should beware of community. What? Whoever can't be alone should see the community as potentially danger? This is what he says. Such people will only do harm to themselves and to the community. So you stood alone before God when God called you. Alone also you had to obey God's voice. God, when he called you, you were called alone. Alone you had to take up your cross. Alone you've had to struggle. Alone you had to pray, and alone you will die, and alone you will give account to God. You cannot, here's what it says, avoid yourself. For it is precisely God, this is powerful, who singled you out. Sounds like Isaiah from Isaiah 6. For it's precisely God who singled you out, not you. If you do not want to be alone, you are rejecting Christ's call on you, and you can have no part in the community of those who are called. What is he saying there? Students, for those of you that are really struggling in isolation just because you're missing out on your social time, this is basically, in a youthy version, what Bonhoeffer is telling us. You need to be okay being alone because God has called you personally. He hasn't just called you to join a club. He's called you into a relationship with him. That's what evangelicals like to call a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Bonhoeffer's kind of saying that. He's saying he's called you for a specific task. He's called you into a personal relationship. And what he doesn't mean by this is a highly individualized thing. He's talking about he still called you personally, but he hasn't called you just to be an individual. That's what's called existentialism. Christianity is existential, but it's not existentialism. Okay? So we don't just believe on being independent and being an individual, but it has more in common with being a Buddhist and being kind of in your own celestial mind and ascending than it really has to do with being social and being Christian, okay? So he's saying, you got to understand, when God called you, he singled you out. This is a lot like when God called Moses. This is a lot like when God called Isaiah. This is a lot like when God called his son, Jesus Christ. You know, this is my son in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him, right? So there's this danger of feeling isolated just because we're missing out on all of our social time. We're missing out on all of our clubs. We're missing out on all of our team sports. And then we kind of get depressed. And that's okay. It's okay to want those things. But what Bonhoeffer is trying to teach us and what I'm trying to tell to you all is be careful in identifying yourself solely by those things. Because then what you're doing is you're actually excluding yourself from God's call that is on your life and mine personally. Is a personal job, a personal mission, a personal relationship that he's calling you to. Don't neglect that during this time. Dig into that. And then for the rest of us that are like, yippee, I get to be alone, finally, all me, my time, movies galore. Ross is like, books forever, and drowning in books in the back, and it's just me and God, that's also dangerous. And you out there, you know who you are. I'm included in this group, okay? This is what Bonhoeffer says right after. This is what he says. But the reverse is also true. Whoever cannot stand being in community should beware of being alone. You are called into a community of faith. The call was not meant for you alone. You are called to carry your cross, your struggle, and pray in the community of faith, the community of those who are called. You are not alone when you die. On the day of judgment, you will be only one of a great number in the great community of faith in Jesus Christ. If you neglect the community with other Christians, you reject the call of Jesus Christ, and thus your being alone will become harmful to you. What is he saying? He's saying this: you've misunderstood Christian faith. If you see isolation as your salvation, as your rescue, you're missing the point, okay? You're missing that he's called you into. He's not just called you personally, okay, which what we just said. He's called you personally into his beloved community, into his beloved people. So don't neglect the assembling together, it says in Hebrews 10, 24 and 25. Don't neglect the gathering together. Well, Ross, how do we do that? We're in this period of isolation. Christians are always called to love. We're not called to individualize ourselves. We're not called to creating our own brands, as younger people like to say today, my brand. That's not what Christians are called to, okay? We're called to community, though we're called personally into that community. So God esteems us as individuals, which is powerful. Very few religions do that. Do you understand that? Most religions call you to assimilate. It's incredible. Christianity esteems your personhood, but yet doesn't leave you in that personhood, but calls you into communion with other people. So it's not just about you and you and you. It's about you, God, and your neighbor, who, if you all are believers in Jesus Christ, you're called the brethren, or the people of God, or the church of Jesus Christ. It's powerful when you start to understand your identity is not just in your feelings or your isolation or your personal experiences, but are somehow also kept up and included with the community of Jesus. So you have a dual identity as an individual, as a person, but yet also in the people of God. And this is why Dietrich Bonhoeffer says in the very first word he says in this book on community, he talks about Jesus' ministry. And this is what he quotes. He quotes Psalm 133, verse 1, and he says, "How very good and pleasant it is when kindred live together in unity." Psalm 133. The Christian cannot simply take for granted the privilege of living among other Christians. Jesus Christ lived in the midst of his enemies. And in the end, all his disciples abandoned him. On the cross, he was alone, surrounded by criminals and the jeering crowds. He had come for the express purpose of bringing peace to the enemies of God. So Christians too belong not, listen clearly, belong not in the seclusion of a cloistered life, but in the midst of our enemies. There we find our mission in our work. We find our purpose. So students, what do we need to take away as we're facing loneliness, as we're facing isolation? Some of us are super excited about not having to do all the social time anymore and just kind of getting into our heads and getting to our little hobbies. I basically want to say two things to you, okay? First, love is something about another person, okay? The culture loves to prop up self-love. I get where that's coming from, but that's not necessarily really what love's about. Love is directed towards another ultimately, okay? Now, it's fine to love yourself, but the Bible is saying love is really meant to be given, not just given to self, but given to someone else. So as we think about if you're struggling with loneliness right now, here's a great way you can connect with the people of God. Pray for them. We've talked about this before. St. Paul says in Philippians 1:3, "I thank my God every time I remember you in my prayers." Think about that. You can connect with people without being in their presence, but yet spiritually being in their presence by praying for them. That's what I'm doing a lot. I'm feeling close to a lot of you just because I'm praying for a lot of you. Pray for people. Don't just sit and stew and be sad. Pray for people. Connect through prayer. And if you're also isolated, you know what you can do? You can call somebody. You can reach out. Don't wait on the professional Christian guy to do it. You're part of the body of Christ, okay? I'm your pastor, you know? I'm not the one who's plugged in to play for you. I'm the person who's called to equip and help you. But here's the help. You reach out yourself, as many of you already have, okay? What about you that are, you know, your fear of the community has been released and now you get to sit down in your PJs and watch, you know, Lord of the Rings extended cut repeatedly, or watch all 22 movies of the Marvel Universe into chronological succession. For those of you that are doing that, first of all, kudos to you for the stamina. But I would encourage you, you weren't made for that, okay? God didn't make you for video games. He didn't make you for Netflix streaming. He didn't even make you for Marvel Universe 1 through 22. He made you for himself and for his people. So I'd encourage you, pray, how could you be loving them right now? How could you support me? You know, how can you support Liz? How can you support those wonderful volunteers that have spent so many hours supporting you. Love is directed towards somebody else, not necessarily yourself. Its ultimate goal is somebody else. So being isolated should not be your salvation. Christ is your salvation. Okay? And ultimately, I think God is saying that we are in a time where we don't get the privilege of having communion together and fellowship together. So hopefully this is encouraging each one of you students to, one, not take for granted your church and not taking for granted your youth ministry, and making sure that you support them and love them when we're near and when we have time together. Because this is a time that shows us that it's a privilege. It's not something that we get just because we want it. Okay? So I want to encourage you, if you're struggling with isolation or you're giddy with isolation, let God's word form you that you were not called just to be in a club, but God has a purpose for you. Dig into that right now. Get into God's word. Spend time in prayer. Reach out to people. If you're just giddy because of all your isolation time, maybe don't indulge so much in all that, and start to reach out to other people and check in on them and see how they're doing. Even your adult leaders, be good. And lastly, isolation doesn't have to stay isolated, okay? So just because you're alone, you're not alone. It says in 1 John 2 that Jesus intercedes for us. Even when we're not praying, he's praying for us. Hopefully that'll encourage you to reach out too, okay? So this will conclude our 4-part series on Teen and Christian. I hope it's been an encouragement to you. We are going to start next week a new series called When I Was Your Age. And I'll have a special guest for those episodes named Liz Turner, who is my wife, longtime girlfriend. Sign off.